but I hope that we can find hope in it. In fact, I've been reading one of Eric Fromm's books on hope, and he has an interesting contrast between passive hope and active hope. Passive hope is just hoping that somebody's going to come along and make things better. Active hope is the belief that you can make something better. And so you get to action to make that happen. So I'll begin by pointing out that although most of what's written in the Torah about the origins of the Jewish people is mythology, not history, those who over the centuries have come to identify as such have seldom, if ever, had it easy, and have often been treated as pariah in their own land and also while living in the land of others, including having endured the most horrific genocide in human history, resulting, of course, in the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews. Today, there is still much prejudice and ill will in the world toward Jewish people, including here in the U.S. Last week, we saw an assailant in Boulder, Colorado, use a homemade flamethrower and Molotov cocktails to attack a group of Jews demonstrating on behalf of Israeli hostages. Although the man charged in this horrendous crime is a foreign national, both men responsible for the murder of 2 Israeli embassy workers outside the Capitol Jewish Museum a couple of weeks ago, and for the arson attack against Pennsylvania's Jewish governor, Josh Shapiro, and his family on the eve of Passover last month, are U.S. citizens. Unlike the Holocaust, however, it should be understood that all 3 of the men responsible for these inexcusable crimes claim to have done so in retaliation for the state of Israel's injustice against Palestinians. To simply label their actions as anti-Semitism, akin to the racist scapegoating that occurred in Nazi Germany and elsewhere over the centuries, is to ignore and divert our attention away from the more than 50,000 Palestinians, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, mostly women and children, who have been indiscriminately killed at the hands of the Israeli military, along with over 100,000 others who've been wounded. To be clear, Israel's actions are in response to the horrible Hamas October 7, 2023 attacks that resulted in the cold-blooded murder and torture of more than 1,250 innocent Jewish people and the capture of more than 250 Jewish hostages. But Israel's response has literally been overkill. Both the International Criminal Court and the United Nations have charged Israel with war crimes and crimes against humanity for this reason. They have reportedly bombed hospitals, killed aid workers and journalists, and routinely blocked food and medical supplies from reaching sick, injured, desperate, and starving Palestinian people. And before going further, I want to point out some of the informal fallacies being used to justify these obviously inhumane and illegal actions and conditions. When asked about these charges of war crimes, some U.S. politicians, along with Israel's own leadership, respond that Israel has a right to defend itself. Of course it does. Of course it does. And we could only expect, sadly, that its response to the brutal and inhumane October 7 attacks would result in additional bloodshed and death, including many innocent civilians. But this reply is a straw man argument that subtly diverts the discussion to a different question than the one being asked. The question is not, does Israel have a right to defend itself? The question is, does Israel have a right to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity by indiscriminately bombing civilians and then denying them humanitarian aid? The appropriate response to the first question is yes, but the answer to the real question is absolutely not. No wonder those seeking to justify these heinous, inhumane criminal acts prefer to shift our attention to a question that nobody is asking. Accusing those who remain focused on the real questions of anti-Semitism, furthermore, is an ad hominem fallacy because it also diverts attention away from the real question by demonizing whoever is asking it or pointing out, the inhumane actions of Israel. After the ICC issued warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's arrest last year, he said the decision cast shame on the court, ad hominem, that the court is a rogue prosecutor, ad hominem, and that it was an anti-Semitic decision, ad hominem. None of which addresses his own violent disregard for the lives of Palestinian civilians. That's what we're trying to address here. A few years ago, after I committed to addressing the injustices that Israel has been perpetrating upon the Palestinian people since 1948, leaders of our local Jewish community warned me not to do so and told me that if I continued, there would be a problem. I did, and there was. And now I am labeled anti-Semitic by many and have zero relationship with my former Jewish friends and once community cohorts. We've seen the same thing happening to college students around the U.S. who have exercised their free speech by engaging in pro-Palestinian demonstrations. They've been accused of being anti-Semitic, and now some colleges, including Harvard, are themselves accused of anti-Semitism for allowing these demonstrations to have taken place on their campuses. The real point of these absurd accusations, however, is not to stop anti-Semitism, but to stop the real question from being asked. Does Israel have the right to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity by indiscriminately bombing civilians and then denying them humanitarian aid? Or more pointedly, does Israel have the right to engage in ethnic cleansing? Or any of the other injustices against Palestinians it has engaged in for decades. Another error at thinking in play here is the fallacy of composition, which attributes the qualities of some members of a class to the entire class. And this faulty way of thinking is the root of all prejudice, including racism. Trump committed it when first running for office by suggesting that no immigrants should be allowed to enter the U.S. from Mexico because some of them are drug dealers, rapists, and criminals. Similarly, those responsible for the October 7 attack in Israel were Palestinians, acting on behalf of Hamas, the militant Islamic resistance movement. But this does not mean that all Palestinians are members of Hamas. And it certainly does not mean that all Palestinians are responsible for that attack. Yet Israel seems to be holding all Palestinians responsible by not discriminating between the innocent civilians and the militants that it wants to eradicate. Likewise, to hold an entire university responsible for what some of its students say, or to hold all protesters responsible for the words of a few, is faulty reasoning, to say nothing of the fact that we're talking about protected speech to begin with. They get to do that. Even worse, of course, is to hold an entire class of people responsible for the actions of some individuals or subgroups within that class. All of these fallacies are meant to avoid questions or to avoid certain comments, or forbid them, I should say, discourage certain comments from ever even being expressed. Ad hominem, in particular, is a scare tactic meant to make a public example of anyone who voices unwanted words. If they do, as I was warned, there will be a problem. I should add that defending the Palestinian people as a whole does not justify the horrific violence some Palestinians have engaged in against Israel and Jews living elsewhere. Nor does it justify the brutal actions of those individuals involved in the heinous and indiscriminate crimes against Jews in the U.S. these past weeks. To be pro-Palestinian does not mean one must be against Israel. This is a false dichotomy. If one is fundamentally for humanity and for life, then one is for the humane treatment and welfare of all people and the peaceful resolution of conflict whenever possible. This, by and large, was the purpose of the more than 120 protests that occurred on college campuses during 2024 in response to the relentless atrocities committed against scores of innocent Palestinians standing between Israel and Hamas. Such demonstrations always include some individuals who speak more passionately and angrily, and perhaps some who will say things that are inappropriate and that some participants will disagree with. But this is the nature of free expression, the right to say things that others disagree with, the right to publicly say things, especially in public spaces, that other people disagree with. The overall goal of the student protesters was for their universities to divest from companies supporting Israel, along with a few other demands specific to certain campuses. The legal questions emerged when student protesters began setting up encampments on the campuses. Over 117 of them on 121 campuses, along with some occupying buildings and preventing other students and faculty reasonable access to classrooms and other facilities. University administrators took various approaches to resolve these situations, resulting in approximately 18% of the schools partially agreeing to the student demands, and to just over half of them forcibly removing the encampments. And those forced removals also resulted in the arrest, suspensions, expulsions, and the withholding of degrees in some cases for some student protesters. In many cases, Jewish students merely claiming that they felt unsafe have been the basis for charges of anti-Semitism against protesters. This, to me, is akin to the boy who cried wolf phenomenon. Claiming to feel unsafe in response to hearing things that one may disagree with has become rampant on today's campuses, as has requiring professors, for example, to give trigger warnings before saying anything that might disturb the sensitivities of a particular student, which makes it difficult to take any such claims seriously. The few incidents of violence that have been documented appear to be the result of aggressive confrontations on both sides. An incident at UCLA in April of 2024, for example, occurred when a pro-Israel group allegedly attacked protesters, which has resulted in a lawsuit against the university for not adequately protecting the pro-Palestinian protesters. That same month, New York Times published an article with the headline, "Some Jewish students are targeted as protests continue at Columbia." Some Jewish students are targeted as protests continue at Columbia. That's a pretty definitive statement, isn't it? Now here's what the byline under the headline says. After reports of harassment by demonstrators, some Jewish students said they felt unsafe. Others said they felt safe while condemning anti-Semitism. That's a very different byline than the headline suggests. The offenses that the article goes on to cite as examples of targeting Jewish students only describe speech, not actions. Some pro-Palestinian demonstrations on and around campus veered into harassment, it says, and protesters targeted some Jewish students with anti-Semitic vitriol, and verbal attacks left a number of the 5,000 Jewish students at Columbia fearful for their safety. It doesn't say how many of the 5,000 students they're talking about, nor what the vitriolic statements were. There's no evidence in the article of what was said that is considered anti-Semitic. Just an appeal to those who felt unsafe. Now, questioning the so-called lived experience of those who said they felt threatened, but may not have actually been threatened, is precisely what can get a person canceled these days, which I recognize I am in danger of, again, for doing right now. But these terms, felt unsafe, fearful, harassment, anti-Semitic vitriol, all given without citing anything that was said to anyone. That's what I said about my own book. What is it? Just lift a sentence for me to justify these accusations. Don't cite anything, let alone anything that was done to somebody. It makes such claims spurious. In fact, the article goes on to admit that some Jewish students who are supporting the pro-Palestinian demonstrations on campus said they felt solidarity, not a sense of danger, even as they denounced acts of anti-Semitism. Again, the article doesn't mention what acts it is referring to. At the very least, this discrepancy indicates the Times article is reporting on subjective experiences and not objective truths. As one who, again, has been accused of making anti-Semitic comments simply for standing up for the dignity and humanity of Palestinians, as have many, and for harming others by saying things that they disagree with, I am skeptical of any such claims. Yet today, the Trump administration is seeking to punish Harvard and Columbia universities, among others, for not having quickly stopped the students from speaking out on this issue, passionate, angry, and even inappropriate as some of their protected speech may have been. Less than 2 weeks ago, for example, Trump began threatening to withdraw billions in funding from Harvard, calling the prestigious university very anti-Semitic. According to a BBC report just 3 days ago, the Trump administration is also looking to strip Columbia University of its accreditation over claims it violated the civil rights of its Jewish students, and that his education secretary, Linda McMahon, said in a letter to the New York City College that it acted with deliberate indifference towards the harassment of Jewish students in a manner that violated federal anti-discrimination laws. These should make interesting court cases, since, as usual, the Trump administration has offered no evidence of these claims, and because these universities are being accused of not doing something. In this case of not controlling the free speech of others, which is not a crime. A crime involves doing something. And when it comes to freedom of speech, U.S. courts and laws so far have been far more liberal than any other democracies in the world. Exceptions to such speech in the U.S. include harassment, terroristic threatening, inciting a riot, hate speech, slander, and libel, most of which are extremely hard to prove and prosecute. Most lawyers won't even take on these cases. If accusations of anti-Semitism should fall under the categories of harassment, terroristic threatening, or hate crime, the courts will require evidence of real harm, not just hurt feelings or feeling threatened. That's not harm. To be clear, there is nothing criminal about making negative or unwanted comments about other people. The American news media does it every day. More germane to my topic, the freedom of speech movement was born on our college campuses. And the right of their professors, faculty, and students to exercise such freedom has been repeatedly upheld by the highest court. As far back as 1957, for example, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of an academic who had been jailed for refusing to answer questions about some of his lectures. Chief Justice Earl Warren explained, "The essentiality of freedom in the community of American universities is almost self-evident. No one should underestimate the vital role in a democracy that is played by those who guide and train our youth. To impose any straitjacket upon the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities would imperil the future of our nation." And indeed, it is now imperiling the future of our nation. In 1967, the New York State had a law that effectively prohibited state employees from being members of the Communist Party. The State University of New York successfully sued over the matter because it required employees to sign an oath stating that they were not communist, once again firmly guaranteeing the principle of academic freedom. And in 1972, the Supreme Court again ruled against Central Connecticut State College for refusing to recognize an on-campus chapter of the Students for a Democratic Society, a left-wing student activist organization, calling it unconstitutional and determining that the First Amendment applies to all public institutions. Hopefully, should the cases Trump is proposing go that far, this Supreme Court will continue to defend freedom of speech at Harvard and Columbia universities and universities throughout the nation. Before Israel was established in 1948, Palestine, the name of that region, was home to Arabs, to Jews, to Christians, all with ancient ties to that region. Though Jewish scriptures tell of escaped slaves led to a promised land, historians suggest the early Hebrews were likely a loose confederation of oppressed people who settled in the hill country beyond the Canaan Valley, gradually uniting their stories and forming a shared identity. Eventually, they were briefly unified under a very effective Chief David, King David, whose reign became the foundation for messianic hopes of restoration. Geez, if we could only get a guy like that in office again. You know, it never happened. Yet throughout history, Jews rarely controlled the land exclusively, living under success, and it was never at peace. In fact, they themselves split into two nations, right? Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judea, from which we get Jews, the southern kingdom. But never in peace. And they were living under one successive empire after another: Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, the Greeks, the Romans. And around 135 CE, after crushing a Jewish revolt, Rome renamed the region Palestine to sever Jewish ties to it. The Palestines, as you may have heard me say in the past, is actually the Roman pronunciation of Philistine. So it was intentionally named after the legendary enemies of the Israelites. And some Jews remained and likely assimilated with the evolving Palestinian population, which means both of these groups are intricately related. While most were scattered in various diasporas over 100 years periods, or even up into our own time. And remarkably, despite centuries of exile and persecution, including the Holocaust, Jewish identity has endured. That is a remarkable, singular, historic accomplishment. After World War II, Israel was founded in this same already inhabited region as a Jewish homeland, but only after displacing over 1 million Palestinians from their homes and their cities, whose ancestors had lived there for centuries. The resulting conflict has persisted, fueled by hostility from surrounding nations and enduring resentment against Jews around the world. The situation has worsened dramatically, obviously, after the vile Hamas attacks of October 7th. But let me be clear, while Israel's own cruelty and injustice are partly responsible for such events, because we could give peace a chance, instead of an Iron Dome being a strategy for permanent survival. The inhumanity of the actual perpetrators of these attacks cannot be justified as they were just defending themselves, any more than this excuse can justify Israel's actions. The October 7 attackers were intentionally sadistic toward innocent Jewish civilians, mostly young people, at a concert, who became the tragic victims of their diabolical, sick, twisted cruelties on that day. My concern for the lives and well-being of Palestinian people does not mean I regard these brutes with any less outrage than I hold for Benjamin Netanyahu and the soldiers carrying out war crimes and crimes against humanity on his behalf. Today, freedom of speech is under assault, including in the U.S. and other so-called free countries. There is tremendous pressure and serious potential consequences to speaking out about almost anything these days, but especially about the important things, like what is and has been happening to Palestinians for more than half a century. Using our freedom of speech, our right to say what we believe is so about this and other important matters, too often takes courage these days. It takes courage in a free country. But as religious liberals, devoted to the principles that our democracies are supposed to be founded upon, we must find the courage we need to say, and more importantly, to do what we can to foster human rights and human welfare everywhere. To paraphrase the great American revolutionary Thomas Paine, these are the times that try Unitarian souls. The summer Unitarian and the sunshine liberal will in this crisis shrink from their service to their great principles. But those that stand by them now deserve the love and thanks of all people everywhere. Today we are living in trying, fearful, uncertain times, yet even as the world changes around us, we remain the same because our values remain the same. And they shall be our compass in whatever storms may come and our guiding star in the darkest of nights. Thank you. Thank you.